In every community, there's always someone the people believe in without question. A figure of trust, a guide, a protector. But what happens when the person you look up to the most is hiding the unthinkable? What happens when the man everyone calls a shepherd turns out to be the wolf? In the quiet town of Magnolia Heights, faith was the heartbeat of the people's lives. Sunday mornings echoed with hymns, and the church stood tall as a symbol of hope. But beneath the sanctuary's stained glass windows, a chilling secret was waiting to be uncovered. It began with a frantic call, a missing girl, a family desperate for answers, and a congregation shaken by fear. Days later, a shallow grave was discovered on the outskirts of town. A body lay hidden beneath the dirt, and in the victim's lifeless hand was a cross necklace, a symbol of her faith, now a haunting clue in her death. How did it come to this? How did a man trusted with the community's faith become the architect of its greatest betrayal? To understand the depths of this tragedy, we must go back to where it all began. Where trust was given freely, love was manipulated, and the price of betrayal was paid in blood. Pastor Elijah Carter was a man larger than life in Magnolia Heights. At 44, he had spent over 2 decades building his reputation as a beacon of morality, a voice of wisdom, and a man who walked closely with God. Standing tall with a commanding presence, he carried an air of authority that was softened by his warmth and charm. Elijah was known for his eloquent sermons, words that could uplift the weary and inspire the hopeful. From the pulpit of Magnolia Baptist Church, his voice would fill the sanctuary, captivating everyone from children in the back pews to elders in the front row. For many, he wasn't just a pastor. He was a father figure, a counselor, and a trusted confidant. When he spoke, people listened. When he prayed, people believed. Elijah's influence extended far beyond Sunday sermons. He ran youth programs, organized food drives, and visited the sick. Parents sought his advice, and the younger members of the congregation often saw him as a guide through the trials of adolescence. His role wasn't confined to the church walls. It was woven into the fabric of Magnolia Heights. But no one ever questions the man who speaks for God. No one looks too closely at the hand they trust to lead them. Elijah's charm was his strength, but as the story would later reveal, it was also his weapon. Naomi Daniels was the kind of girl who made you believe in the future. At just 18, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind born from overcoming adversity. Her life hadn't been easy. After losing both parents in a car accident when she was only 10 years old, she was raised by her grandmother Clara, a woman of unwavering faith who found solace in the church. Naomi had dreams. She wanted to be a gospel singer, to take her voice beyond the church choir and onto the world stage. Her talent was undeniable. Her voice had a richness that could silence a room and a sincerity that moved hearts. But Naomi wasn't just her talent. She was driven, ambitious, and kind-hearted. She often stayed after school to tutor younger students and spent weekends volunteering at the church, organizing choir practice, or helping with Sunday school. Her faith was her anchor, and Pastor Elijah was her guide. For Naomi, the church was more than a place of worship. It was a sanctuary, a second home. She trusted Elijah completely, seeing him as both a mentor and a bridge to her dreams. It was easy to believe in him when he told her she was destined for greatness, and perhaps that trust was what made her so vulnerable. Magnolia Heights wasn't just a town, it was a family. Then community that made up its heart was tight-knit, bound together by shared history, traditions, and faith. At the center of it all stood Magnolia Baptist Church, a towering white structure with stained glass windows that gleamed in the sunlight. To the people of Magnolia Heights, the church wasn't just a building, it was the foundation of their lives. From morning prayers to evening choir rehearsals, Magnolia Baptist was always alive with activity. Youth programs brought children together in the summer, Sunday school shaped young minds, and midweek Bible studies gave the congregation a place to share and reflect. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals all passed through its doors, marking the milestones of life. But more than that, the church was a haven. It was where people came to seek guidance, to heal, and to hope. It was a place where burdens felt lighter and futures seemed brighter. And at its helm was Elijah Carter, the man everyone believed was chosen to lead them. To the people of Magnolia Heights, Elijah was more than a pastor. He was a symbol of stability in an uncertain world, a man who could be trusted to keep the community grounded and strong. Parents trusted him with their children. The elderly looked to him for wisdom, and when things went wrong, Elijah was the first call, the first prayer, and the first step toward making things right. But trust, as they would soon learn, can sometimes be misplaced. Naomi Daniels was a girl with dreams that reached far beyond the modest streets of Magnolia Heights. But for every dreamer, there is often someone who claims to see their potential before they can fully recognize it themselves. For Naomi, that person was Pastor Elijah Carter. Naomi had grown up singing in the church choir, her voice maturing from the soft, timid tones of a child into the commanding, soulful sound that could quiet even the most restless congregation. From the very beginning, Pastor Elijah noticed her. It wasn't just her voice, it was her energy, her ambition, her desire to turn adversity into something beautiful. To him, she was special, someone worth investing in. At first, Naomi admired Elijah from a distance. He had a way of making people feel seen, as though their lives mattered in the grand tapestry of God's plan. His sermons spoke directly to her heart, and his ability to inspire felt almost otherworldly. So when he approached her after a choir rehearsal one evening, she was thrilled. "Naomi," Elijah had said, his deep voice steady yet warm, "your voice is a gift from God. It's not just something you use, it's something you share. I see greatness in you, and I'd like to help you nurture it." Naomi's heart soared. To hear such words from the man everyone respected so deeply was overwhelming. She nodded eagerly, hardly believing her luck. He offered to mentor her, not just in music but in faith, a partnership that would strengthen her gifts and prepare her for the world. The mentorship began innocently. After choir practice, Naomi would stay behind while the other members filed out, the sound of their laughter and chatter fading as the church grew quiet. In those moments, it was just her and Elijah, sitting in the front pews with an open Bible or a hymnal between them. They talked about Scripture, about finding inspiration in the Word, and about how to bring that inspiration into music. Elijah encouraged her to think deeply about the messages in the songs she sang. "It's not just about hitting the right notes, Naomi," he would say, leaning forward with a smile that felt almost paternal. "It's about touching hearts. When you sing, people should feel God's presence." Naomi hung on his every word. She practiced harder than ever, determined not to disappoint him. And the results were visible. Her performances became more powerful, more heartfelt. The congregation noticed, and so did Elijah. Word spread quickly through the church. Parents spoke proudly about how Pastor Elijah was helping Naomi blossom. Other young members of the congregation looked up to her, inspired by her newfound confidence. To everyone on the outside, it was a story of mentorship done right, one more example of Elijah's dedication to his flock. But inside Naomi's heart, things were changing. For a girl who had lost so much so young, Elijah's attention felt like a lifeline. Her parents' deaths had left a void that her grandmother, no matter how loving, couldn't fully fill. In Elijah, Naomi found a different kind of connection, a guide, a mentor, and maybe even a reflection of the father she missed so deeply. She didn't realize it then, but she began to crave his approval. Every compliment he gave felt like a triumph. Every moment he spent with her felt like a privilege. Naomi's vulnerability was easy to overlook. On the surface, she was confident and driven, but beneath it all was a girl desperate for validation. Someone who wanted to believe she was as special as Elijah said she was. She began to interpret his kindness in ways she couldn't fully understand, feeling a mix of admiration and something more. Elijah, too, started to see Naomi differently. At first, his attention was focused on her talent, her potential. But as their sessions grew more frequent and their conversations more personal, something shifted. He began to notice her laughter, the way she lit up when she sang, the way she leaned in just slightly when he spoke. These moments were fleeting, small, almost imperceptible shifts that neither acknowledged. But they were there, and they were growing. The community, unaware of these subtle changes, continued to praise Elijah for his guidance. Naomi's grandmother often smiled as she spoke of how much Naomi was benefiting from his mentorship. "Pastor Elijah has been such a blessing," she told a friend after Sunday service. "He's giving her the tools she needs to succeed." And Naomi believed it too. She told herself that Elijah's interest in her was purely professional. purely spiritual. He wanted her to succeed, to reach the dreams she had whispered in prayer every night since she was a little girl. That's all it was. But deep down, Naomi couldn't ignore the way her heart quickened when Elijah placed a hand on her shoulder in encouragement, or how his compliments felt more personal than professional. She pushed the feelings aside, telling herself she was imagining things. Elijah, on the other hand, wasn't imagining anything. He told himself he was helping her, that his attention was part of his role as a pastor. But in the quiet moments, when Naomi's voice filled the empty church or her laughter echoed through the sanctuary, he felt a pull he couldn't deny. What began as guidance, voice heavy with foreboding, would soon become something no one in Magnolia Heights could imagine. The sanctuary of trust that Elijah had built was beginning to crack. But for now, no one could see the storm brewing beneath the surface. Every story of betrayal begins with a moment of hesitation, a moment when lines blur and boundaries crack. For Naomi Daniels and Pastor Elijah Carter, that moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly, until there was no turning back. For Naomi, it began as a subtle change, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Elijah's words of encouragement felt heavier, laden with meaning she didn't fully understand. His compliments shifted from her singing to her appearance, small comments at first, almost innocent. "You look radiant today, Naomi. You have a glow about you," Elijah would say with a smile that lingered just a second too long. Naomi, barely 18, interpreted his words through the lens of her own longing. She had never experienced the kind of attention Elijah gave her, warm, focused, unwavering. It felt special, as though he saw her in a way no one else ever had. Her feelings, once rooted in admiration, began to shift towards something deeper, something she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore. Their conversations grew more personal. After choir practice, they would sit alone in the church's small office, talking about her dreams, her fears, and her struggles. Elijah listened with an intensity that made her feel important, as if her voice mattered in a way it never had before. "You're not like other girls your age, Naomi," he told her one evening. "You're wise beyond your years, and you have a heart that's pure and full of potential." Naomi's cheeks flushed at his words, her heart racing in a way that both thrilled and confused her. She told herself it was nothing more than admiration, but the truth lingered in the back of her mind. She was falling for him. Elijah, too, felt the shift, though he struggled to make sense of it. For weeks, he rationalized his growing feelings, telling himself they were born out of his role as a mentor, a guide. But deep down, he knew better. He noticed the way Naomi's laughter filled the room, the way her presence seemed to brighten even the darkest days. And he couldn't ignore the way his pulse quickened when she was near. Late at night, Elijah wrestled with his thoughts, pacing the floor of his study as guilt and desire battled for control. He prayed for clarity, for strength, but his prayers felt hollow, his mind always drifting back to Naomi. He told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong, that his feelings were harmless so long as they stayed hidden. "She's just a girl who needs guidance," he muttered to himself, staring at the Bible on his desk. But the words felt empty. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he convinced himself he was protecting her, helping her navigate a world that often seemed too harsh for someone so pure. As their connection deepened, Elijah began to justify his actions in ways that felt more and more like lies. He told himself their bond was unique, that no one else could understand her the way he did. And when his thoughts strayed further, he told himself it was God's will, that he was meant to be in her life for a reason. The night it all changed started like any other. The choir had finished a late rehearsal for an upcoming service, and the other members had trickled out one by one, leaving only Naomi and Elijah in the quiet sanctuary. Naomi lingered at the piano, her fingers dancing lightly over the keys as she hummed a hymn. Elijah watched from the shadows, his heart heavy with thoughts he couldn't suppress. He approached her slowly, his voice breaking the silence. "That was beautiful, Naomi. You've truly been blessed with a gift." She turned to him, smiling shyly. "Thank you, Pastor Elijah. I couldn't have come this far without your guidance." Their conversation started innocently enough, but as the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere shifted. Elijah moved closer, his words softer, more intimate. He spoke of her beauty, her strength, her potential. Naomi, caught in the moment, felt her heart pounding in her chest. His words wrapped around her like a warm embrace, filling the void left by years of loss and loneliness. Then, in a moment that neither could take back, Elijah reached out and touched her hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried a weight that neither could deny. Naomi didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with both fear and longing. "You're special, Naomi," he whispered, his voice trembling. "More than you know." Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that felt both forbidden and inevitable. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The sanctuary, once a place of worship, became the backdrop for a betrayal that would change their lives forever. When the moment ended, both were left breathless, their minds racing with the implications of what had just happened. Elijah spoke first, his tone urgent. "Naomi, no one can know about this. Do you understand? People will twist what we have into something it's not. They'll ruin you, ruin us. Promise me you'll keep this between us." Naomi hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. She nodded slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I promise." What began as admiration had transformed into something neither of them could control. And as the doors of Magnolia Baptist Church closed behind them that night, the secret they shared became the first step toward the devastation that would follow. In the quiet of that night, a line had been crossed, and neither Naomi nor Elijah could foresee the storm that was about to consume them both. Naomi's days had become a whirlwind of emotions. The late-night whispers with Elijah, the stolen moments filled with promises she clung to, all felt like a dream she couldn't let go of. But as the weeks passed, a gnawing unease took root within her. Her body felt different. Small changes she couldn't ignore. A missed period confirmed what her heart feared but her mind refused to acknowledge. At first, Naomi convinced herself it was nothing. Stress, perhaps, but as the days turned to weeks, her anxiety grew unbearable. Late one night, alone in the small bathroom of her grandmother's home, she stared at the faint lines on a pregnancy test. 2 lines. Positive. Her breath hitched as a rush of emotions overtook her. Fear gripped her, cold and unrelenting. And Elijah, the man she loved and trusted, would surely feel the same. Wouldn't he? Naomi clutched the test to her chest, whispering a prayer for guidance. In her heart, she believed Elijah would stand by her. After all, he had promised he cared for her, that their connection was special. Surely, this was a sign, part of a divine plan. A few days later, Naomi found herself once again in the quiet confines of Magnolia Baptist Church. It was their usual meeting spot, private, away from prying eyes. Elijah was sitting at his desk, reviewing notes for his next sermon, when she entered. He smiled at her, the kind of smile that had once made her feel safe. But today, that smile only deepened the weight in her chest. She sat across from him, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. He noticed her nervousness immediately. "Naomi, what's wrong?" he asked, leaning forward. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of concern. Naomi took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the room was silent. Elijah stared at her, the smile fading from his face. He opened his mouth to speak but found no words. The reality of what she'd just said hit him like a tidal wave. "Are you sure?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi nodded, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "I took a test. It's positive." Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His marriage, his congregation, his reputation. Everything he had worked for was now hanging by a thread. If this got out, it would destroy him. The community would turn against him, his wife would leave, and the church he had poured his life into would crumble. "This can't be happening," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Naomi's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. "I thought you'd be happy. We can figure this out together." Her words, spoken with such hope, only deepened his panic. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as Naomi watched, her heart sinking. "Naomi, do you understand what this means?" he snapped, his tone sharper than he intended. "If anyone finds out, my wife, the church, this could ruin everything." Naomi's eyes filled with tears. "But I thought you loved me," she said, her voice trembling. Elijah stopped pacing, turning to face her. He softened his tone, trying to regain control of the situation. "Naomi, I do care about you. I do. But this is complicated. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Do you really want to be tied down like this?" She shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "This isn't just about me," It's about us, about our child. Elijah stepped closer, his expression earnest. Naomi, listen to me. If this gets out, people will judge you. They'll call you names, ruin your reputation. Is that what you want? His words stung, cutting through her like a knife. She looked away, unsure of what to say. Elijah seized the moment, his voice growing more insistent. There's a way to fix this, he said. We can make it go away. No one has to know. We can keep everything the way it was. Naomi's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. You're asking me to have an abortion? Elijah hesitated, then nodded. It's the only way, Naomi. Think about your future. Think about everything you've worked for. This doesn't have to change anything. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. I can't do that. This is our child. I won't just make it go away. Elijah's frustration boiled over. Naomi, be reasonable. This isn't just about you. It's about me, about my family. If you care about me, if you care about us, you'll do this. But Naomi stood her ground, her voice trembling but firm. I won't. This baby is a blessing, no matter how it came to be, and if you really cared about me, you'd stand by me. For the first time, Elijah saw a side of Naomi he hadn't anticipated, her strength, her resolve. He realized she wasn't going to bend to his will, and it terrified him. As she stood before him, defiant and unyielding, his mind raced for a solution. Fine, he said finally, his tone cold. But you have to understand something. If you keep this child, you're on your own. I can't be involved. Naomi's heart shattered at his words, but she refused to let him see her break. She turned and walked out of the office, her tears falling freely as the weight of his betrayal settled over her. Elijah watched her go, his mind consumed by a single dark thought. If Naomi wouldn't terminate the pregnancy, there was only one way to protect himself, a way he wasn't ready to admit, but one that lingered like a shadow in the corners of his mind. As Naomi stood firm, Elijah began to see only one way out, a decision that would change everything. When faith becomes a weapon, it carves wounds far deeper than the sharpest blade. For Elijah Carter, the path to preserving his image had narrowed into a single, unthinkable solution. It wasn't the act of a man guided by faith, it was the desperate decision of a man consumed by fear. The late summer sun dipped low on the horizon as Elijah sat alone in his study, his hands trembling as he stared at the syringe lying on the desk before him. The small vial of sedative, purchased in secret from a contact he barely trusted, gleamed under the faint light of the desk lamp. It was meant to be a quiet solution, a way to erase the mistake without leaving a trace. Elijah's mind raced as he rehearsed the plan over and over. He had chosen the abandoned church on the outskirts of Magnolia Heights for its isolation, a place where no one ventured anymore. Its sagging roof and broken windows were a far cry from the warm sanctuary of the church he led every Sunday. But for tonight, its desolation served his purpose. He picked up the syringe with a shaky hand, slipping it into the inner pocket of his coat. His chest tightened as doubt clawed at him, but he quickly shoved it aside. This is the only way, he muttered to himself, the words a fragile thread holding his resolve together. His reputation, his family, the church, they all depended on him making this decision. Reaching for his phone, Elijah dialed Naomi's number. The sound of her voice, so full of trust and hope, sent a pang through his chest. Naomi, it's me, he said, his tone measured. I need to see you. There's something we need to talk about the baby, about your future. Naomi hesitated on the other end, but her desire for reassurance won out. All right, where do you want to meet? The old church, he replied. It's quiet, and we won't be disturbed. Naomi agreed, unaware of the storm brewing in Elijah's mind. He hung up, his heart pounding as he prepared to leave. The plan was simple, he told himself. Quick, clean, necessary. Naomi arrived at the abandoned church just as twilight began to settle over the town. She hesitated at the entrance, her eyes scanning the decaying building. The wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping inside to find Elijah waiting near the altar. You came, he said, his voice steady but his expression unreadable. Of course, Naomi replied, clutching her bag nervously. I thought we could talk about what happens next. Elijah motioned for her to sit on one of the pews. He began to speak in soothing tones, weaving a narrative about their future, about how they could overcome this challenge together. Naomi, desperate for reassurance, hung on to his every word. But as she spoke about her hopes for the baby, Elijah's resolve began to waver. He watched her, his mind flooded with conflicting emotions. For a brief moment, he considered stopping. He could confess everything, accept the fallout, and find a way to live with the consequences. But then he thought of his wife, his congregation, and the fragile pedestal he stood on. His hand moved to his pocket, feeling the syringe hidden there. This has to be done, he thought, repeating the mantra he had clung to for weeks. For the greater good. As Naomi turned to adjust her bag, Elijah acted. He approached her under the guise of comfort, placing a hand on her shoulder. Before she could react, he plunged the syringe into her arm, depressing the plunger with practiced precision. "What are you doing?" Naomi's voice trembled as the sedative began to take effect. Her vision blurred, and her body grew heavy. "It's all right, Naomi," Elijah murmured, his voice a mix of false reassurance and suppressed panic. "You just need to rest. This is for the best." Naomi slumped against the pew, her consciousness fading. Elijah stood over her, his hands shaking as the weight of what he had done pressed down on him. But it wasn't over yet. He still had to finish what he started. Dragging Naomi's limp body outside to the overgrown churchyard, Elijah worked quickly, his every movement fueled by desperation. He placed his hands over her mouth and nose, applying pressure until her body stopped responding. The stillness that followed was deafening. As he stared down at Naomi's lifeless form, Elijah's mind oscillated between justification and despair. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered to himself, tears streaming down his face. "She would have ruined everything, my family, my church. I'm protecting them." But beneath his rationalizations lay a deep, gnawing guilt. He thought of Naomi's laughter during choir practice, her radiant smile as she spoke about her dreams of becoming a gospel singer. He had taken all of that away in a single, monstrous act. "I'm a man of God," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I was supposed to guide her, protect her." The irony of his words twisted like a knife in his chest. He had betrayed not only Naomi, but everything he claimed to stand for. Elijah grabbed a nearby shovel he had stashed earlier and began digging. The soil was hard and unyielding, as though the earth itself resisted his actions. Each shovelful felt heavier than the last, a grim reminder of the life he had just extinguished. Finally, he placed Naomi's body in the shallow grave, covering her with dirt, until there was no trace left. As he stood over the grave, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Not for forgiveness, but for the strength to carry on. "No one can ever know," he thought. "This is my burden to bear, my secret to keep, for the sake of my family, for the church." Elijah turned and walked away, the weight of his crime pressing down on him with every step. But no matter how far he went, the echoes of what he had done followed him, a shadow that would never let him go. When Naomi didn't return home, her grandmother initially assumed she had stayed late to rehearse. But as the hours dragged on, unease settled over the house. It wasn't like Naomi to ignore her curfew or fail to call if plans changed. Worry grew into fear when Naomi's phone calls went unanswered. By morning, it was clear something was wrong. Miss Daniels went to the local police station, her hands trembling as she filled out the missing persons report. She described Naomi's last known whereabouts, her bright smile, and the unmistakable bond she had with the church. Her voice cracked as she pleaded with the officers to act quickly. She'd never just disappear. "Something's happened, I can feel it." The local authorities took her concerns seriously. Naomi's reputation as a devoted student and active church member made her sudden disappearance alarming. Officers were dispatched to canvass the area, starting with the church and its surrounding neighborhoods. They asked questions, knocked on doors, and searched for any clue that might explain Naomi's absence. Word of Naomi's disappearance spread like wildfire. Magnolia Heights, a community bound by shared faith and mutual trust, was plunged into collective shock. Neighbors whispered theories over picket fences. Members of the Magnolia Baptist Church gathered in small prayer circles, clutching their hands tightly as they begged for Naomi's safe return. At the heart of the congregation was Pastor Elijah Carter. Standing at the pulpit, he delivered an impassioned sermon titled "The Lost Sheep." His voice trembled with emotion as he spoke of Naomi, describing her as a bright light in their community. "We must trust in the Lord's plan," Elijah declared, his words carrying a mix of solemnity and hope. "Naomi is one of our own. Together, as a family, we will do everything to bring her home." The congregation nodded in agreement, their faith in Elijah unshaken. To many, his concern felt genuine, a shepherd grieving for one of his flock. But beneath the surface, Elijah fought to maintain his composure, knowing that every word he spoke was a thread in the delicate web he had woven. As the search intensified, officers expanded their efforts to include outlying areas. A tip led them to the outskirts of town, near the abandoned church where Naomi had last been seen. The building, long forgotten by most, now became the focal point of the investigation. In the overgrown grass near the church's entrance, an officer spotted something glinting in the sunlight. Kneeling down, they uncovered a delicate silver necklace with a small charm spelling out Naomi. The discovery sent a jolt through the investigative team. They knew they were on the right track. The necklace was bagged as evidence, and a full-scale search of the church and its grounds began. Officers combed through every inch of the property, from the crumbling pews inside to the wild brush encircling the churchyard. Their persistence paid off when they noticed an area of disturbed soil near the edge of the property. The ground, uneven and slightly sunken, seemed out of place amidst the otherwise undisturbed landscape. Shovels were brought in, and as they dug, their worst fears were confirmed. Buried just beneath the surface was a shallow grave. Wrapped in a simple cloth lay Naomi Daniels, her body unmistakable even in its stillness. The scene was a devastating blow, not only to the officers but to the community they knew would soon face this heartbreaking news. The discovery of Naomi's body sent shockwaves through Magnolia Heights. For the police, it was the turning point in their investigation. But as they carefully cataloged the evidence and processed the scene, they stumbled upon something else. Something that would blow the case wide open. Among the dirt and debris lay an object that would connect Naomi's tragic death to someone no one would have suspected. A single piece of evidence that would unravel Pastor Elijah Carter's carefully constructed world, leaving no question about the depth of his betrayal. With the discovery of Naomi Daniels' body, the investigation turned sharply toward uncovering the truth. But unraveling the layers of deception surrounding her death would take investigators into the shadows of trust, betrayal, and secrets hidden in plain sight. It was time for the fall of Elijah Carter. The turning point in the investigation came when officers obtained Naomi Daniels' phone records. While reviewing her recent calls and messages, they found an unsettling pattern. Text after text between Naomi and Elijah painted a picture of a relationship that had strayed far from the boundaries of mentorship. Naomi's messages reflected her growing anxiety over the pregnancy and her hope that Elijah would support her. Phrases like, "I thought you said you cared about me," and "I won't do what you're asking, it's our baby Elijah," stood out as cries for stability and love. In stark contrast, Elijah's responses carried a darker tone. He had tried to coax, then guilt, and eventually threaten Naomi into terminating the pregnancy. "You don't understand what's at stake," one of his texts read. "This could ruin everything for both of us." Another chilling message left no doubt about the pressure Naomi faced. "If you don't handle this, you're on your own. Don't make me regret everything I've done for you." These records weren't just evidence of their affair. They revealed a man consumed by fear and willing to manipulate Naomi to preserve his public image. Investigators knew they had uncovered a crucial piece of the puzzle, but they needed more to prove Elijah's involvement in Naomi's disappearance and murder. As detectives delved deeper, they began interviewing anyone who might have seen or interacted with Naomi on the night she disappeared. One such person was Mr. Leroy Jennings, the church's part-time janitor. A soft-spoken man in his late 60s, Leroy had been working at Magnolia Baptist for years, often unnoticed in the background of the church's bustling activities. When questioned, Leroy hesitated at first. But as the weight of Naomi's death hung in the air, he recounted something he hadn't thought much of at the time. On the night of Naomi's disappearance, he had seen her entering the church just before sunset. He remembered her because she had greeted him with her usual kindness, a bright smile that lingered in his mind. "She came in like she always does," Leroy explained. "But this time, she looked uneasy, like she was thinking hard about something." Leroy then mentioned seeing Elijah Carter arrive shortly after. The two had entered separately, but Leroy noted the distinct tension in the air, as the pastor walked past him. "I didn't think much of it then," Leroy continued, "but when they both stayed late and I left for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling something was different." Leroy's account didn't confirm that they left together, but it placed both Naomi and Elijah at the church that evening, providing investigators with a timeline that tied Elijah directly to the crime scene. Armed with the phone records, Leroy's statement, and the evidence from the gravesite, detectives brought Elijah Carter in for questioning. The community's revered pastor arrived at the station with his head held high, his demeanor calm. But behind his composed exterior was a man teetering on the edge. The interrogation began with routine questions about Naomi's disappearance. Elijah stuck to his narrative, claiming he had last seen her during a choir practice days before she went missing. But as investigators began to present their findings, his confidence began to crack. "Pastor Carter," one detective said, sliding the phone records across the table, "we have evidence of multiple conversations between you and Naomi in the days leading up to her death. Care to explain?" Elijah glanced at the documents but remained silent, his jaw tightening. The detective pressed further. "You called her the night she disappeared. You asked her to meet you at the old church. Why?" Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his composure slipping. I was just trying to help her," he stammered. "She was troubled, and I was offering guidance." But the detective wasn't buying it. "Guidance? Is that what you call an affair?" He tossed a series of printed text messages onto the table. "These messages suggest otherwise, Pastor." Elijah's face went pale as he scanned the damning evidence. He denied the affair at first, insisting Naomi had misunderstood his intentions, but the weight of the evidence was too much to bear. Finally, under relentless questioning, Elijah admitted to the relationship but continued to insist he had nothing to do with her disappearance. "She wanted more from me than I could give," he said, his voice cracking. "But I didn't hurt her. I swear, she left town. She said she needed space." The detectives leaned in, their voices firm. "Then how do you explain her body being found at the abandoned church, the very place you told her to meet you?" Elijah's head dropped, his hands trembling as the room fell silent. The man who had stood as a pillar of strength and morality was now exposed, his secrets laid bare. He offered no further explanation, his silence an admission in itself. As Elijah Carter was led out of the station in handcuffs, the weight of his betrayal pressed down on everyone who witnessed it. The man who had preached of redemption and salvation now faced the harsh reality of his own sins. But as the investigation continued, a single piece of evidence would emerge that would seal Elijah's fate and reveal the true extent of his deception, a revelation that no one in Magnolia Heights could have prepared for. The courtroom was packed to capacity as the trial of Pastor Elijah Carter began. This was no ordinary trial. It was a reckoning, a battle for justice for Naomi Daniels, whose life and dreams had been cut short. But it was also a trial that exposed the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of betrayal. The prosecution came prepared, armed with a mountain of evidence that painted a chilling picture of Elijah Carter's calculated actions. Lead prosecutor Danielle Howard took the jury through each harrowing detail, starting with the night Naomi disappeared. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and resolute, "this case is about a man who used his position of power to manipulate, betray, and ultimately silence a young woman who trusted him." She presented the phone records, which showed Elijah's numerous calls and messages to Naomi, culminating in the one that lured her to the abandoned church on the night of her death. The texts were read aloud in court, each one a reminder of the emotional and psychological pressure Elijah had placed on Naomi. Forensic evidence was the prosecution's strongest weapon. A vial containing traces of the sedative used to incapacitate Naomi was found in Elijah's car, hidden beneath the seat. The forensic expert testified that the same sedative was detected in Naomi's bloodstream during the autopsy. "This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime," the expert stated. "This was premeditated. The presence of the sedative indicates careful planning." But the most damning evidence came from Elijah's own boots, which were seized during his arrest. Soil samples taken from the treads matched the unique composition of the dirt found at Naomi's gravesite. The expert confirmed that there was no other plausible explanation for the match. Elijah had been there, and he had buried Naomi's body. As the evidence mounted, the courtroom atmosphere grew heavier. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had not only violated Naomi's trust, but also the trust of an entire community. Elijah Carter was a shepherd who preyed on his own flock, Howard declared in her closing argument. He betrayed Naomi, his congregation, and his role as a spiritual leader. Today we ask you to hold him accountable. Outside the courthouse, the mood was tense and divided. The once united congregation of Magnolia Baptist Church was now fractured, torn between loyalty to their pastor and the demand for justice. On one side were the supporters, holding signs that read "Innocent until proven guilty" and "Pray for Pastor Elijah." They insisted that the evidence was circumstantial, that Elijah was a good man who had been wrongly accused. "I've known Pastor Elijah my whole life," one congregant told reporters. "He's a man of God. This doesn't make sense." But on the other side were those who had once trusted Elijah and now felt betrayed beyond repair. They held signs demanding justice for Naomi and wore ribbons in her favorite color, blue, in her memory. "He was supposed to guide us, not destroy us," said another member. Naomi was just a girl, full of life and promise. He took that from her. The trial became a spectacle, with news outlets flocking to Magnolia Heights to cover every detail. The town's once quiet streets buzzed with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. The once revered church stood as a symbol of shattered trust, its pews emptier than ever as members struggled to reconcile their faith with the actions of their leader. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments, and emotional witness statements, the jury deliberated for just over 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent, every eye on the foreperson as the verdict was read. "We find the defendant, Elijah Carter, guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of power." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Some congregants wept openly, while others sat in stunned silence. Naomi's grandmother clutched a framed photo of her granddaughter, tears streaming down her face as a wave of relief and sorrow washed over her. The judge's sentencing was swift and resolute. "Mr. Carter, your actions represent a grave abuse of trust and power," the judge said, his voice firm. "You manipulated and betrayed a young woman who looked up to you, and you silenced her to protect your image. For these reasons, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Elijah sat motionless, his once commanding presence diminished to nothing. The gavel struck, sealing his fate. As the echoes of the trial faded, the town of Magnolia Heights was left to grapple with the aftermath. The scars left by Elijah Carter's actions ran deep. Not just for Naomi's family, but for an entire community that had placed their faith in him. For Naomi's grandmother, justice was bittersweet. The conviction couldn't bring Naomi back, nor could it erase the pain of her loss. But it did offer a measure of closure, a recognition of Naomi's worth, and a condemnation of the man who had stolen her future. The church, once the heart of the community, stood as a reminder of what had been lost. Its doors remained open, but the congregation would never be the same. Trust, once freely given, was now guarded. The pulpit where Elijah had preached stood empty, a silent testament to his betrayal. Naomi Daniels was a young woman with dreams that could have lit up the world. Dreams of music, faith, and a future filled with promise. But those dreams ended in betrayal. Her story is not just a tragedy. It is a stark reminder of how unchecked power and blind faith can destroy more than just a single life. It shattered a community, fractured a family, and left scars that will never fully heal. Pastor Elijah Carter was a man revered by so many, trusted without question, and held to the highest regard. But beneath the surface, he wielded that trust for his own selfish purposes, silencing the very person who looked to him for guidance. His actions serve as a chilling example of the damage that can be done when power goes unchallenged. Naomi's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we protect those we love from the very people we trust the most? How do we ensure that authority is wielded responsibly, and that no one, no matter their position, is beyond accountability? These are the questions we explore with every story we tell. If you believe in the importance of exposing betrayal and holding those in power accountable, Subscribe to our channel and join us in shining a light on the truths that often remain hidden in the shadows. And now, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons can be learned from Naomi's story? How can communities work together to prevent tragedies like this from happening again? Your voice matters, and together we can demand the accountability that every story like this deserves. Thank you for watching.